Alright guys, welcome back to Unit 14, the Civil War, the American Iliad. Just to kind of review, we've already covered Part 1, the Civil War Awakening, where we looked at the year 1861. We already covered Part 2, 1862, in which we saw the war intensify. What we want to do now is cover Part 3, the Turning of the Tide, 1863. Just to kind of set this up, the year 1863 is actually going to represent the high mark for the Confederate States of America. When this year will end, it will mark the beginning of the end of the Confederacy. But what we want to focus on here in 1863 is how the tide of the war turned against the Confederacy. And the best way to explain this is to talk about the three big battles that occurred in 1863. Now, look, there were lots of battles that occurred in 1863, but we want to focus on the three big ones because these battles explain to you how the tide ultimately will turn against the Confederacy and in favor of the Union. And when the year 1863 started out, it's actually started out very well for the Confederacy. So let's talk about the lead up to probably the most famous battle of the American Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg. So we'll do each of these battles, we'll briefly talk about the background, then the battle itself, and then the significance. As we go through the battles, you don't need to take down notes on every single aspect of the background or every single aspect of the battle. What you really want to focus attention on is why these battles were significant. But this is the Battle of Gettysburg, so let's talk about the background to it. You know, I kind of already mentioned that the year 1863 started off very well for the Confederacy, and that's because in late 1862, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee won a gigantic victory over the Union Army at a battle known as the Battle of Fredericksburg. Now, we don't have time to talk about it, but this was a big victory for Robert E. Lee in late 1862. In early 1863, Robert E. Lee scored another gigantic victory where he defeated two Union armies in what was known as the Battle of Chancellorsville. Again, we don't get to really talk about it, but there's a map if you're interested in it. You can pause and check it out. The Battle of Chancellorsville, interesting enough, is considered Robert E. Lee's finest hour. It's a battle that is still studied in the U.S. War College. It really shows you the brilliance of Robert E. Lee as a commanding general in this war. The point here is that 62 ends on a high note for the Confederacy. 63 begins even better for the Confederacy after the Battle of Chancellorsville. The last time Lee felt this good and the last time morale was this high in the Confederacy, remember, this is when Lee decided to launch a raid into the North that resulted with the Battle of Antietam. Well, with morale high and the war going well for the Confederacy here in 1863, Lee decides to go ahead and launch another raid into the North. Now, his decision to launch this raid into the North was based upon achieving some certain objectives. Once again, one of his objectives was to get the war out of Northern Virginia, give that area of Virginia some relief. But one of the biggest objectives for Lee in launching this new raid into the North was that he wanted to affect Northern morale, which after the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Northern morale was at an all-time low. It was in the dumps. And what we saw actually in 1863 was a peace movement beginning in the North, in which some people in the North were beginning to think that this war was unwinnable and that it might be better for the Union to make a peace with the Confederacy. And so one of Lee's objectives here was to kind of push that Northern morale over the edge and embolden the peace movement that's taking place here in the North. So in the spring of 1863, Lee will go ahead and launch this raid into the North for these objectives. As his army begins moving north, and here's a map here on the left that shows you towards the bottom there, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. We talked about those. You can see that Lee's army begins moving north through the Shenandoah Valley. As he moves north, the Union Army has to stay between Lee's army and the Union capital of Washington, D.C. The picture on the right is an actual picture of Lee's army moving north through the city of Winchester. That's an actual picture taken on this march. So, beginning in the late spring, early summer of 1863, Lee's army begins moving north, and the Union Army is shadowing Lee's army as it moves north, staying between Lee's army and Washington, D.C. The forward units of these two large lumbering armies will literally bump into each other in a small town in southern Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. And that's how this battle is going to come about. So I want to focus now just on the battle itself. The battle was a 3-day battle, one of the longest battles of the war. And I kind of want to talk about each day and describe to you how it went and ultimately how the battle was won and what it all meant. All right, so the battle. To start it all off, the commanders here at Gettysburg, of course for the Confederacy, was Robert E. Lee. But for the United States, we have a new commander. After Fredericksburg and after Chancellorsville, there were two different Union commanders at both those battles. We don't have time to talk about them, but because of their defeats in both those battles, both of them were fired. Just like Irwin McDowell, the first one, and just like George B. McClellan, the second Union general. The fourth Union general that Lincoln appointed was the man on the right there, a man by the name of George G. Meade. Now, he may not look like much. In fact, he looks a lot like a turtle. He may not look like much, but he actually was a really good commander, and he'll be in charge of the Union forces here at Gettysburg opposing Robert E. Lee's army. So if you remember, the first day of the battle was only fought between the forward units of these two great armies, so we didn't have a lot of soldiers in and around Gettysburg on the first day. And the fighting that began that day on July 1st, 1863, was just small-scale fighting. The bulk of the armies are going to arrive later, and that fighting that took place on the first day started real late in the day. So by nightfall of the first day, the Union Army had in fact been pushed out of the city of Gettysburg to a position just south of the town, in which they established a fishhook defensive line south of the city of Gettysburg along what is known as Cemetery Ridge. And during the night, that's when the bulk of these two armies arrived and both began preparing for the second day of the battle. So the first day of the battle was just kind of like an appetizer. It wasn't fought by the bulk of these armies. It was just the forward units. Gettysburg was taken by the Confederacy, but just south of the town, the Union was now occupying Cemetery Ridge, which was the high ground. And it was a really good defensive spot. During the night, that's when the bulk of the two armies arrived, solidified their lines, and that set up the second day of the battle. On July 2nd, the second day of this battle, Robert E. Lee's army will attack the flanks of both sides of the Union Army. Now, the attacks here on the second day by Lee's army are some of the most famous engagements of the American Civil War. If you know your Civil War, we don't get to talk about all of them, but if you know your Civil War history, Day 2 at Gettysburg, this would have been the attacks on places like Culp's Hill, Little Round Top, the Peach Orchard, and the famous Devil's Den. The point here for Lee was he was trying to turn the flanks on both sides of the Union Army so that the Union Army would have to fall upon itself and it would be surrounded by the Confederacy. Now, these assaults on the Union flanks on Day 2 both failed. And at the end of the second day, the Union still held the high ground and its flanks were still in place. This set up the decisive day of this battle, and that will be Day 3. Now, before we talk about Day 3, here are some famous pictures of some of the most famous engagements of Day 2. The picture you see on the left, some of the Confederate dead at a place known as the Peach Orchard. And then there on the right is the famous Devil's Den. Devil's Den was an area in which the combat took place in a very rocky area, people popping out left and right. It was just an absolute nastiness. But this was the fighting on Day 2. Now, Day 3, the decisive day of this battle, Lee's plan on Day 3 was to attack the very center of the Union lines. He believed that his actions on Day 2 made the Union Army think that the attack would come again on the flanks, that the flanks were really weakened because of the Day 2 engagement. So Lee decided that the Union probably would have reinforced their flanks, and so an attack on the middle of the Union lines would likely break the Union lines and win the day. The problem is that Meade was a pretty good commander for the Union, and overnight he understood that Lee would likely attack the middle of the lines, and so overnight the Union reinforced that portion of their lines. And what that meant then is that before this day of battle even began, Lee's army was going to be walking into a bloodbath. Now you can see on this map right there in the middle of the Union lines where you see the names Pickett, Trimble, and Pettigrew. This was where the main assault of the Confederates would be. They would be opposed, of course, on the other side by a famous Union general named Hancock. This was the momentous assault on Union lines in Day 3 at Gettysburg. This was also referred to as the famous Pickett's Charge. It's also known as the high tide of the Confederacy. The picture on the left shows you the tree line on the on the battlefield of Gettysburg. The rock wall you see in front of you, that was the Union line, and from that tree line, about 12,500 Confederate infantrymen would walk across that huge field while being peppered with rifle fire and artillery fire. Some of the Confederates were able to breach this stone wall, but they were able to not hold this thing, and ultimately the attack was repulsed with over 50% casualties. In fact, Pickett's own brigade of about 5,000 soldiers was almost completely wiped out. And this was the decisive defeat that will end the Battle of Gettysburg. After 3 days of fierce fighting, Meade was expecting Lee to attack again, but that attack never came. On July 4th, nothing happened. But on July 5th, Lee's army retreated back into northern Virginia. That is being depicted in the painting on the right, and on the left you can see Lee's retreat from Gettysburg back into northern Virginia. By mid-July, Lee's army will be out of the north, and the Gettysburg campaign has come to an end. Okay, so that was the Battle of Gettysburg. We know the background, we know the battle. Now, why is it significant? This is where you want to pay particular attention. The Battle of Gettysburg was significant because it ended Lee's second raid into the north, and it ended it as a complete failure. For all the reasons Lee launched the raid, he failed. It did not embolden the peace movement, it did not affect northern morale, and he was not able to score that big victory he always seeks on northern soil. The other reason the Battle of Gettysburg was significant is that this was the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. Now, you remember we talked about Antietam, but that was the bloodiest single day. This was the bloodiest battle. And this was a 3-day battle, so it makes sense that it might be the bloodiest. How bloody was it? Well, combined, you had nearly 50,000 casualties. And casualties are dead, wounded, and missing. For the United States, 23,000, roughly. For the Confederacy, 24,000. So not only does this end Lee's second raid into the north, but it's also the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. But the big reason I've included Gettysburg in here as the first battle in which we see the turning of the tide is that Lee's army lost so many men at this battle, men that simply were, it was really hard for him to replace these 24,000 casualties. It's easier for the Union to do it, but it's hard for the Confederacy. So Lee's army, as a result of this battle, would never be strong enough to take the war to the north. It would never be able, from here on out, to go on the offensive ever again. That means then that for the rest of the war, he's going to have to fight on the defensive. What does that all mean? Well, this does not bode well for the Confederacy. This is going to put the Confederacy at a severe disadvantage. So essentially, Gettysburg is significant because it forces Lee to just have to sit and wait for the Union onslaught, which will come in the very next year. So this was Gettysburg, the first of the 3 battles that show you how the tide began to turn against against the Confederacy. Okay, the second of these battles is known as the Battle of Vicksburg. So that's where I want to turn to next. Okay, so just like we did with Gettysburg, we'll talk about the background, then we'll talk about the battle or the siege. The Battle of Vicksburg is more of a siege. That'll make more sense here in a second. And then we'll talk about the significance of it. So again, you don't need to write down every single little detail of the background or the battle or the siege, but pay particular attention to the significance of this. This is largely where your quiz and exam questions will be derived from. Okay, so background to the battle or the siege of Vicksburg. Since the very beginning of the Civil War, the Union had adopted a strategy to control the entire perimeter of the Confederacy. The name of this strategy was known as the Anaconda Plan. According to the Union strategist, if they could control not only the coast of the Confederacy, but also the northern border of the Confederacy, as well as the Mississippi River, that this would in fact be a snake surrounding the Confederacy. And if you don't know what an anaconda is, that's a snake. And an anaconda kills its prey not because of its venom. It kills its prey by grabbing it and squeezing it to death. And so this was kind of the strategy from the beginning of the war for the Union, was to control the entire perimeter of the Confederacy in an attempt to squeeze it and strangle it and kill it. And by 1863, the coast of the Confederacy had been blockaded, it had been controlled, and the northern border between the North and the Confederacy had been controlled. So it meant then by 1863, the last portion of the Anaconda Plan needed was the Mississippi River. And by late 1863, the map here on the right is a little convoluted, but if you can see right in the middle there, there's a city called Vicksburg. And then way down south in Louisiana, you see another city called Port Hudson. Well, between Vicksburg and Port Hudson was the only portion of the Mississippi River that by 1863 the Confederacy still controlled. This was a corridor that was vital to the sustainment of the Confederate war effort back east. Through this corridor between Vicksburg and Port Hudson, there would have been a lot of beef from Texas, a lot of reinforcements from Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas that would have been ferried through this corridor. So for the Union, this corridor needs to be shut. And you can either take Vicksburg or you can take Port Hudson. Take one of them and the other one falls. Well, in late 1862, Lincoln instructed the commander of the Western Union armies, the guy we already saw at the Battle of Shiloh, Ulysses S. Grant. In late 1862, Lincoln instructed Grant to make the capture of Vicksburg, Mississippi a priority. And that's a picture of Vicksburg taken from the Louisiana side of the Mississippi River. That picture was actually taken around the time of the battle. So by late 1862, Lincoln has pinpointed Vicksburg as the target and has instructed Ulysses S. Grant to do everything possible to capture the city of Vicksburg. This proves to be harder than it is harder than just simply ordering it. Beginning in March of 1863, Grant will try everything possible to surround the city of Vicksburg. He at first tried to just march overland through the north, but you can see on this map where it says Steele's Bayou and the Yazoo River, that entire area is flooded. It's a swamp. And Grant first tried to march his army through there, but that failed. He then actually tried to dig a canal. And you can see right outside the city of Vicksburg in Louisiana where it says Williams Grant Canal. He actually tried to dig a canal to bypass the city, but that failed as well. Now, why does he need to get, why can't he just assault the city? Well, the city is heavily defended. He cannot just float his military down the Mississippi River bypassing the city. If he puts his soldiers on naval ships and floats them past the city of Vicksburg, his entire army is going to get blown out of the water. And I'll show you pictures here in a second. Vicksburg was a heavily defended city. So he's got to find a way to bypass the city to get his army south of Vicksburg where the ground was dry and he could march his army. He finally decides on a plan in which he will march his army through Louisiana on the other side of the Mississippi River, march them south until the land is dry enough to get them across the Mississippi River. At the same time that his army is marching south through Louisiana, Grant will instruct the U.S. Navy to go ahead and float with no troops on board, go ahead and float by the defenses of Vicksburg, which they did on Christmas. On April 16th, while a big party, I don't know why I was saying Christmas, a big party was going on in Vicksburg, so a lot of the defenses were not manned. Most of the Union Army or Union Navy got by the city before the firing began. Now, this doesn't really bother Grant because these boats you see on the picture, they don't have any troops on them. So it's okay if you lose a few of them. The point here was that the Union Navy floated by the city, came down where on April 30th, down around Bruinsburg, they ferried the Union Army across the Mississippi River. Now, Grant has his army south of the city on dry land. He is now in a position to take the city. His first thing of action was to to go far east and take the city of Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson was the supply base for Vicksburg. Once he had taken Jackson, he has now isolated Vicksburg. You can see on the map he then begins to move his army west, fighting a couple of battles along the way, known as Battle of Champion Hill and the Battle of the Big Black River Bridge. The point here is that in mid-May, he has arrived at the gates of Vicksburg. But again, Vicksburg is a heavily defended city. The Confederates are well dug in. There are magnificent redoubts and artillery pieces all along a defensive line stretching south of the city all the way north of it. This is a tall order for Ulysses S. Grant to be able to break these lines and capture the city. Now, that doesn't deter Grant. When he first arrives at the city, or when he first arrives at the defenses of Vicksburg, he will make. So let's go ahead and talk about the battle and the siege now. Grant is going to make 2 unsuccessful assaults on the Confederate lines. And again, these are unsuccessful because the Confederates are so well dug in, the city is so well defended. After 2 assaults on the Confederate lines, Grant decides, well, I've got the city surrounded. Why don't I just wait them out? What Grant decided to do is establish his own siege lines, his own network of trenches and redoubts and artillery positions. And what he does is he just decides to lay siege to Vicksburg for nearly 7 weeks. Picture on the right there, this is what the Union ended up living in, because they're being fired at too for 7 weeks. They ended up just living on the backside of the hills in basically what were caves. But after for 7 weeks, this siege is going to go on at Vicksburg. No supplies are going to be brought into Vicksburg. No reinforcements are brought into Vicksburg. You can imagine what the standard of living will be like in Vicksburg. Food will run scarce. We know from reports of citizens that lived in Vicksburg that many of them were now living in caves because of the daily bombardments. They, of course, ate all the dogs, ate all the cats, ate all the horses. We know that people were wondering where all the rats they used to see were. There's even reports that they were eating sawdust, and even one report of cannibalism. So you can imagine that after 7 weeks of a siege, the city of Vicksburg is not in a good way. And after 7 weeks, the commander at Vicksburg for the Confederacy, a man by the name of John Pemberton, he was actually a good friend of Ulysses S. Grant. Pemberton, on July 4th, 1863, surrendered the city of Vicksburg to the Union forces commanded by Ulysses S. Grant. And the city of Vicksburg has now fallen to the Union. Okay, so why is this battle of Vicksburg significant? Again, a few reasons. This is where I really want you to pay attention. Well, the fall of Vicksburg was a huge blow to the Southern war effort. Not only will it result in the Confederacy losing control of the Mississippi River, but it was also a huge blow to Confederate morale. If you remember our discussion on Gettysburg, that Lee retreated from Gettysburg on July 4th, 1863, the same day that Vicksburg fell. So imagine if you were a Confederate living in the Confederacy and you learned about Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, you would have learned on the same day that Vicksburg had fallen to the Union. And this is where it gets interesting. While Gettysburg gets most of the attention in Civil War history, Vicksburg might have been more important than Gettysburg. Because after Vicksburg fell, Port Hudson, that last remaining city controlled by the Confederacy, it fell very quickly. So that means the Mississippi River is now in full control of the Union. That means the Anaconda Plan can now be implemented fully. And what it will do is sever the Confederacy into 2. Armies, cattle, supplies, all that stuff can no longer be moved from west of the Mississippi River. So this probably was more important than Gettysburg in understanding how the tide turned against the Confederacy and ultimately why the Confederacy lost. Not only was it a huge blow to Southern morale, but it was also the battle that results in the full control of the Mississippi River by the Union and the full implementation of the Anaconda Plan. And by severing the Confederacy in 2, states like Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, they can no longer take part in the larger war effort that's taking place back east. And the last reason Vicksburg is significant concerns Ulysses S. Grant. If you remember, George S. Meade, or George G. Meade, was the commander at Gettysburg. Well, Lincoln ended up demoting Meade. Why? Well, because he wanted Meade to keep attacking Robert E. Lee even after Day 3 at Gettysburg, but Meade did not do that. For that, Meade was demoted, and in his place, Ulysses S. Grant is placed in full command of the entire Union military, a position he is going to hold until the end of the war. Okay, so the Battle of Gettysburg, Battle of Vicksburg, two of the three battles that take place in 1863 that begin to show you how the tide begins to turn against the Confederacy. The last battle I want to talk about is known as the Battle of Chattanooga. So let's focus on that one now. All right, the Battle of Chattanooga. Again, we'll do the background, the battle, pay particular attention to why the battle was significant. All right, Battle of Chattanooga. If you don't know where Chattanooga is, it is in Tennessee, and it's right along the border between Tennessee and Georgia. You can see it on this map there. Now, by late 1863, the Confederates have established a defensive line outside of the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee, that is designed to prevent a Union invasion of the Deep South. The map on the right shows you in blue where the Confederate defensive line is. It was set along the high ground known as Missionary Ridge. Now the picture on the left actually shows you a picture taken after the Battle of Missionary Ridge. I'll show you another one here in a second on the next slide. In order for the Union to bust out of the city of Chattanooga and open an invasion route into the heart of the Confederacy, the Union is going to need to dislodge the Confederate positions on Missionary Ridge. And here's another photo taken after the battle. That high ground back there is where the Confederacy had its defensive line. It's a very, very formidable defensive perimeter for the Confederacy. Now, so the point here is that the Union is looking to bust out of Chattanooga. It's looking to open an invasion route into the Deep South. In order to do that, they're going to have to kick the Confederates off of the high ground of Missionary Ridge. And that's how the battle is going to come about. The commanders at Chattanooga, of course, Ulysses S. Grant. But for the Confederacy, the Confederate Army defending outside Chattanooga, they were commanded by a man named Braxton Bragg. He's probably one of the worst Confederate generals of the entire war. He only won one battle of the entire war. He was absolutely incompetent. The only reason he ever kept his job is because he was good friends with Jefferson Davis. But he is in charge of the Confederate Army here at Chattanooga. He'll be trying to keep Ulysses S. Grant from winning the war or winning the battle. Now, on November 25th, 1863, the Union attack commenced. And at first it looked as though the Union would not be able to dislodge the Confederates off of Missionary Ridge. And that's when something interesting happened. Rather than die, Union troops just mount a very daring frontal attack straight up Missionary Ridge that is successful in dislodging the Confederates and winning the battle. They were under no orders to do it. They just simply decide, we're not going to sit here and die. We're going to die trying to take the high ground, and they were successful. Once their lines were broken, the Confederates on Missionary Ridge were forced to retreat deeper south back into Georgia, and we'll talk about what happens to them in the year 1864. So what's significant about the Battle of Chattanooga? A few things. Number one is that this was a big, big Union victory. It's oftentimes called a soldier's battle because the battle wasn't actually won because of the planning of the high-ranking officers. Rather, it's won because of the sheer determination of the Union troops. A more recent example of something like this would have been Omaha Beach on D-Day. That is another battle. It's not won because of the planning of high-ranking officers. It's won just because of the sheer determination of the troops. But a more important reason that you should know about Chattanooga is that there is now nothing standing between the Union Army at Chattanooga and an invasion of the Deep South. With the Confederacy now south of the Appalachian Mountains, the Union can now invade over open territory into the heart of the Confederacy. And now this is going to end up leading to a man named William T. Sherman. We're going to talk about him in the next lecture, taking the city of Atlanta, and then ultimately to his famous March to the Sea. All stuff we're going to handle in the year 1864 in Part 4. The other reason Chattanooga was significant is that it snaps the communication lines between the Confederate armies operating in the west and the Confederate armies operating in the east. Railroads, telegraph lines, all that stuff had been running through the city of Chattanooga for the entire war, and the Confederacy has now lost this. What does that mean? It means that Confederate armies will have no coordination anymore. There's going to be no coordination between Confederate armies in the west and in the east. They'll be operating by themselves now. So, Chattanooga, like Vicksburg, like Gettysburg, show you that the tide is turning. And it's all taking place here in 1863. This is why this year, although it started off well for the Confederacy, will end with the Confederacy beginning to lose the war. This is how the tide turned in favor of the Union. Now, this concludes Part 3. In Part 4, we're going to talk about how the Union will take this new turning of the tide and begin to grind down the Confederacy, and talk about how they ultimately go on to win the war.